The Duke of Wynhaven kissed his bride at the altar, and against her ear, so that no one in the crowded cathedral could hear, he whispered, "You should know my heart is buried in the north churchyard, and it will not be coming out." Sophronia did not flinch. He felt her stillness, the small controlled breath, and then she drew back and looked at him with clear gray eyes that held neither hurt nor surprise, only a steady attention as though he had told her the weather. The organ swelled. The congregation rose. Percival, Duke of Wynhaven, took his new wife's hand and walked her down the long aisle past 400 watching faces, and thought, with a cold satisfaction that felt very like grief, that at least he had been honest. He had married her because his solicitors and his mother and the whole weight of the dukedom had made it plain that a man of 38 with no heir and no wife could not go on burying himself alive at Wynhaven Court. His late wife, Cecilia, had been dead 3 years, the whole of his youth and the whole of his happiness, carried off by a fever in a single dreadful week, and with her, so far as he could tell, every warm thing he had ever possessed. What was left was a house full of covered furniture and a man who did his duty and felt nothing, and rather preferred it, because to feel again would mean to have something to lose again, and he had no intention of that. Sophronia Vane had been the sensible choice. She was the daughter of a clergyman of good family, 27, past the first flush of the marriage market and unbothered by it, known for her calm and her competence and her refusal to trade in flattery. When his mother had proposed her, Percival had agreed on one condition, that the lady be told the truth. He would give her his name, his houses, his protection, and his respect. He would not give her his heart because he no longer had one to give. If she could accept a marriage on those terms, he would be glad of her. She had accepted. He had wondered why. He wondered again now, walking her out into the gray November light, as the bells rang, and she smiled the small, composed smile of a woman who has decided something. The wedding breakfast was an ordeal of toasts and glances, and Sophronia bore it beautifully, charming his mother, reassuring his tenants, making even the bishop laugh, and through all of it keeping a little space around herself, a quietness that Percival recognized because he lived inside one just like it. When at last the carriage bore them toward Wynhaven Court and the doors were shut, he braced for the reckoning, the tears now, surely, or the reproach, or the silence of a woman contemplating the bargain she had made. "You needn't look so grim," Sophronia said. "I heard you at the altar. I'm not going to weep about it in a carriage. I merely wonder that you thought it necessary to say. I thought it fairer that you should know where you stood." "I knew where I stood before I stood there. Your mother is not discreet, and neither, I suspect, are you, under all that granite." She looked out at the passing hedgerows. "You loved your wife, she died. You have decided to stop living so that it will not hurt again. I understood all of that in September. I married you anyway. So you may put away the warning, your grace. I am not going to be surprised by a thing I walked toward with open eyes." Percival found he had nothing to say to that. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him without either fear or flattery, and the plainness of it was so unexpected that it left him disarmed and faintly, unwillingly, curious. "Why did you marry me?" he asked. Sophronia considered the question as though it deserved a real answer, which no one had asked her a question deserving in some time. "I am not a great beauty and I have no fortune, and I have watched 3 younger sisters marry while I kept my father's house and told myself I did not mind. I would have made someone a good wife years ago, if anyone had thought to want one. When your mother came, I saw a man who needed a great deal and would ask for nothing, and a house that needed a mistress, and useful work I might do that would matter. I did not marry you for your heart, your grace. I have never been offered a heart, and I have stopped expecting one. I married you because I would rather be needed in a cold house than pitied in a warm one. That is the whole of it." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 3 years, and it struck him silent the rest of the way home. Wynhaven Court rose out of the dusk like a mausoleum, and Percival watched her take it in the shrouded rooms, the closed shutters, the great cold hall where a single fire did nothing against the dark, and waited for her face to fall. It did not. She walked through his tomb of a house with her chin up, and a light already growing in her eyes that he mistrusted at once, because it was the light of a woman making plans. "Yes," she said, mostly to herself, standing in the middle of the frozen drawing room. "Yes, this will do very well." She did not touch Cecilia's rooms. He had braced for it, and she did not do it. The east wing, where his late wife's things lay under Holland covers, remained shut, and Sophronia never once suggested otherwise, and something in him unclenched that he had not known was clenched. But everywhere else she moved through the house that winter like a slow thaw. Shutters opened. Covers came off. Fires were lit in rooms dark for 3 years, and the cold retreated inch by inch down the long corridors, and Percival, coming home from the fields, began to find warm rooms waiting where he had left cold ones. She asked nothing of him. That was the thing he could not account for. She ran his houses with a quiet mastery, sat at the far end of his table each night, spoke pleasantly of the estate and the tenants and the weather, and never once reached across the distance he had drawn at the altar. She did not flirt. She did not sulk. She did not, so far as he could tell, want anything from him at all beyond civility. And it began, against every intention he had, to make him wonder what she thought of him when the candles were out. He watched her without meaning to, with the old head gardener, coaxing out his rheumatism and his opinions with equal patience. With the tenant children, whose names she had learned in a fortnight, kneeling in the mud of the home farm to admire a lamb as though it were the crown jewels. He watched her at the pianoforte of an evening, playing not the mournful things Cecilia had played but bright country airs that drifted down the hall to where he sat pretending to read. And one night he realized he had listened an hour and turned no page, and that the sound had reached some frozen place in him and set it, very slightly, aching. He did not like the ache. The ache meant thaw, and thaw meant feeling, and feeling meant the churchyard again. He redoubled his coldness short with her at dinner, cool in the mornings, and made a point, one evening, of speaking of Cecilia by name, as though to remind them both that the title was borrowed and the heart was spoken for. Sophronia set down the teapot. "Your first wife," she said mildly, took her tea with cream and mourned her the county over, and by every account was a woman worth grieving. I do not begrudge her 1 hour of it, but I am your wife now, your grace, and I take mine with lemon, and I should be obliged if you would learn the difference, because I intend to be pouring it for a very long time." She handed him his cup. "There is no shortage of room in a heart. You have simply forgotten how to open the second door." He took the cup without a word and drank it, and thought about the second door for a fortnight. Winter deepened, and the fever came with it. It went through the village, then the home farm, then the servants' hall, and one gray morning Percival came down to find the house half emptied of its staff and his wife already in her plain gray gown with her sleeves pushed back, directing broth and blankets and clean linen with the calm of a general. He told her to keep to her rooms. She did not so much as look up. "I have had it," she said, "as a girl and cannot take it twice. You have not, so keep to your study and do not be a fool. I will manage." She managed from the sickbeds. For 9 days Percival watched his duchess move through the fevered house without rest, sitting up with the old gardener through the worst of it, holding the hand of a stable boy through a night when the boy's own mother could not come, and Percival, forbidden the sick rooms, found himself following her through the halls at a distance like a man following a light. He carried water when she would let him. He built up fires. He watched her lay her cool hand on burning foreheads and speak low, steady comfort, and something happened in his chest that he had sworn would never happen again, and by the 9th day he had given up fighting it. On the 10th day the fever broke through the house and took Sophronia. He found her at dusk, on her feet still, gripping the back of a chair in the servants' hall, her face gone white and her eyes too bright, and when he crossed the room and put his hand to her cheek it was like touching a stove. "I have had it," she said, and her voice was wrong thick. "I cannot, I have had it," and then her knees went, and Percival caught her before she struck the floor, and the cold that had lived in him for 3 years cracked straight down the middle. He carried her up himself and would let no one else near her. He sat by her bed through the black hours as she burned and spoke to people who were not there, her sisters, her father, a lamb, someone she called dear one that he understood after a long moment to be himself, and he held her hand and said her name over and over, as though the sound of it could anchor her to the world. The physician shook his head and spoke of the crisis to come and could promise nothing. And Percival, who had learned 3 years ago exactly what it was to sit by a bed and be able to promise nothing, felt the whole of that old horror rise up, and knew, with a clarity that was almost peace, that he had failed at the one thing he had set out to do. He had not kept his heart in the churchyard. It had crept out of the grave and given itself, without his permission, to the sensible clergyman's daughter who took her tea with lemon, and now she was going to die, and he was going to feel every hour of it, because there was no longer any door in him shut against her. "I am not done with you," he told her in the worst hour, his mouth against her burning hand. "Do you hear me? You said you meant to pour my tea for a very long time, and I am holding you to it. You do not get to make me feel this and then leave. That is not our bargain. You told me you were not going to surprise me." His voice broke. "Do not surprise me now." The crisis came near dawn. She burned so hot he thought the end was on them, and then, with the gray light coming grudging through the curtains, the fever turned. The heat broke into a drench of sweat, her breathing gentled, the awful bright stare softened and closed into true sleep. The physician, feeling her pulse, let out a long breath and said the word that Percival had not dared to say to himself. She would live. He wept. He had not wept for Cecilia in 3 years of dry frozen grief. He wept now, by the bed of the living woman, his face in the counterpane and her hand held to his cheek, grief and terror and something else breaking loose all at once, and when it was done he felt scoured and new and terribly, gladly alive. Sophronia woke 2 days later, weak as water, to find her husband asleep in the chair by her bed with her hand still held in both of his, unshaven, hollow-eyed and unmistakably changed. She lay looking at him a long while before he stirred. "You are still here," she said when he woke. "I have not left this room in 3 days." His voice was rough. "I find I could not." "You will ruin your health sitting up in chairs." But her fingers tightened on his, and he saw that her composure, that famous calm, had a tremor under it now, and understood that she had been braver at their altar than he had ever guessed. "You said something," she went on carefully, "in the fever, or I dreamed it, about a bargain." "You did not dream it." Percival lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to it. "I told you at the altar that my heart was buried in the churchyard and would not come out. I was wrong. It came out. I did not give it leave. You drew it out with warm fires and country airs and lemon in my tea, hour by hour all winter, and I did not know it was gone until you were dying and I found I could not live without it. I have loved a wife before and lost her and swore never again. And here I am, loving again and having very nearly lost again, and I would not trade 1 hour of the terror to have the old cold back. You were right. There is no shortage of room in a heart. I had only forgotten how to open the second door. You opened it." He held her gaze. "I am not sending you to the far end of the table any longer. I want you beside me. I want to learn how you take your tea and your winters and your whole life, and I want to be there for the pouring of it, all of it, for as long as we are given." Sophronia's eyes filled, the first tears he had ever seen from her, and they undid him more than her calm ever had. "I told you I would rather be needed in a cold house than pitied in a warm one," she whispered. "I did not dare hope to be loved in either." "Be loved then," he said. "In a warm one. I mean to keep the fires lit." She recovered slowly, and he was there for all of it, reading to her through the long convalescence, carrying her down when she was strong enough to sit by the drawing-room fire, learning at last to laugh with her over small things. The east wing stayed shut and honored. There was room, as she had said, for Cecilia's memory and their marriage both, and it was Sophronia who suggested, come spring, that they lay fresh flowers in the north churchyard together, and did. But it was the living heart he tended now. When at last she was well, he did not go back to the far end of the table. He had the great long ceremonial monster replaced with a smaller round one, so that he could sit within reach of his wife at every meal and take her hand between the courses whenever the fancy struck him, which was often. On the first true morning of spring, the shutters thrown wide, Percival came down to find Sophronia already at the little round table, pouring out, and he stopped in the doorway simply to look at her alive, and his, and the maker of every warm thing in the house. "Lemon," she said, holding out his cup, "since you have finally learned the difference." "I have learned a great many differences this winter," he said, and took the cup, and then took her hand as well and did not let go. "The chief of which is that a heart is not a grave. I put mine in one for 3 years. You taught me it was meant to be a hearth. I do not intend to forget it again." And he never did. The court that had been a mausoleum grew loud and bright over the years that followed, full of firelight and country airs, and in time, of small quick feet on the stairs and a little coat left over a chairback where its owner had run off without it, and the Duke of Wynhaven, who had once buried his heart and told his bride so at the altar, kept the second door open and the fires lit, and was, in the end, exactly as warmly loved as he had once been too frightened to hope.